Welcome to the Sunday Morning Linux Review. I'm Mary Tomich,
Tony Bemis.
Tom Lawrence.
and this is episode 251, Fresh Looks. Today we are joined by Jeffery Snover, who is a very distinguished Microsoft person. He is a technical fellow at Microsoft, and Jeffery is here to talk about the Azure Stack, the PowerShell CLI, and other interesting things that you and your team and Microsoft have been working on.
Yeah.
So thank you, Jeffery. We really
thanks for
appreciate you
having
being
me.
here. So why don't you, I know we talked to you, I think back in May at the
Build.
Microsoft Build Conference,
Yeah.
so it's really great to see you again. Why don't you just share with us as far as what you've been doing since the last time we spoke with you, and now as it relates to the Azure Stack and those other items we just mentioned.
Yeah, so we've been getting Azure Stack ready to ship. We announced here that we had released it to manufacturing, and here at the show we've gone general availability. So now you can get and order your parts now and have them delivered and up and running with a private cloud. Azure, the power of Azure, public cloud, running on integrated systems in your data centers. So turns out that's a pretty hard task. Some point I had the interview with a reporter, and they're like, "Well, why is it taking so long?" And it's like, okay, well, public cloud running in your data center. Which part of hard is confusing about that, right? I mean, this is very hard. And in fact, to kind of put that in perspective, if you take a look at people who've tried to do it yourself, private cloud implementations, they almost all fail. I mean, very high failure rates. And it's not that these people are dumb, it's just a very, very hard problem. And so what we're trying to do is not just get something up and running, but to really turn it into an appliance. Something that you spend your time using versus you spend your time trying to get established and keep up and running, right? And so that's even harder to do. So we've been focused on that. And then the second thing we've been focused in on is getting the Linux version of PowerShell in shape to ship. And I think we announced that the release candidate for that would happen next month. So that's very exciting.
Excellent.
Yeah.
After we spoke with you in May, when I went back home, I went ahead and installed it on my Linux machine. So had a chance to work with it a little bit. So it was really kind of fun to see PowerShell on Linux.
Oh, neat.
Yep,
one of the things I've been very concerned about, right? I know, a lot of people in the Linux community our trust needs to be earned in that community. And the thing I'm very sensitive to is that PowerShell, when we bring it onto Linux, that it fits well. And so I've been very eager to hear about all the things where, hey, that doesn't quite work. For example, at some point we'd always said, we need to implement backgrounding, command ampersand. And then we just hadn't gotten to that, right? It's just on the list of priorities, always on the list of priorities, always kind of falls below the list. I said, on Linux, we're not going to ship a shell on Linux that doesn't support backgrounding. So I don't care what you need to do that. And so I'm very interested in hearing from the community those things where they say, hey, you got that wrong, because we absolutely want to be a great member of that community. And just to be clear, I have accepted breaking changes to the language in order to better fit in with Linux. Now, it turns out those breaking changes weren't big. I don't think they're going to affect many people, but they were breaking changes. We made a conscious decision to accept them so that we would be a first-class citizen.
Yeah.
Well, I want to ask a follow-up question to that. As far as receiving feedback from the Linux community relative to PowerShell, is there some kind of mechanism in place to collect that, or is it just...
the amazing GitHub.
There you go. All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, we're doing all of our work in the open. It's open source now, and the other great thing is we're getting community contributions. Like, hey, I don't like this. Da-da-da. There's a great story. I love this. Again, at Microsoft, when we ship things in Windows, we think, okay, let's be clear. This code is going to be used by 1 billion people, and it's going to be supported for 10 or 15 years. So every single line of code, like, oh my heavens, you just worry about this stuff, right? And so there was a particular features, like I think it was some command line. I said, we need to add this switch. And people are like, well, do we really need to? What's the user case for this? Is this really needed? Isn't there a workaround? And so, I go and explain all this, and they're like, okay, fine, long conversations, fine, we'll put it on the backlog. And then prioritize. Like, okay, well, what else would you cut to do this? It's like, oh my gosh. Okay, well, fine.
Yeah.
And so it never got done. And so then we open sourced it, and like 2 weeks after we open sourced it, there was a pull request for the community. They just added the code. It's like, oh, thank you, thank you, thank you.
That's the power of open source.
It
That's
really
right.
is. I was just so thankful.
And it's direct interaction from the users. So, you know, I've commented on projects. There's a little toolkit I found. So someone wrote something. I go on GitHub and I did a little review of it. And then I'm like, you know, if it had this one feature, and I went ahead and submitted it. And an hour later, he reaches out to me and says, I fixed it just so you know. And I'm like, oh, it just, you know, arbitrarily easy for them to do. And I love that direct communication, so I can actually talk with the developers of things. And I think as Microsoft embraces that, you're realizing there's so much community love for that.
Yeah.
And things get done faster.
Absolutely.
'Cause you
Yeah,
know-
they benefit, we benefit, everybody benefits. It's wonderful.
Yeah, you have this constant, instead of having to create focus groups, there's just a perpetual focus group willing to contribute back.
Right, and then there's also the, well, you say you want it, but do you really want it? Do you want it enough to do it? You know, and obviously for big things, that's the
Right.
task, but for little things, and often it's the little things. One of the things I say we did well in PowerShell is we got the core architecture right. I'm proud of that. One of the things I don't think that we've done as well is addressing this long tail of the finishing features, right? And the issue there is that, back to the thing I mentioned, like, well, what's the use case and what things are we going to have to cut in order to do it? And being able to open source this allows us to be more flexible and fluid, but also allows the community to help us address that long tail of issues, that, you know, those little things that just, why didn't you just add that switch? It's not that many lines of code, but for us trying to do it in Windows, it was a big deal. And it was always hard to explain that, like Jeffrey, like, how hard can it be? You know you need to do this, and it's like,
Right.
you know, you don't want to hear about my grief, but
Yeah.
anyway, when you open source, that all goes away.
Yeah, and I love on GitHub how you get direct interaction with the users and with other developers. You know, easy, just right from the community. You know, it's so much easier to do that than trying to go through committee. Like, you have to go through committee to get things in.
Yeah, and you know, we had some tough issues, and you know, we had a point of view. Okay, I think this is the right way to solve it. And if we were just doing this in closed source, that would have been the solution, and we would have shipped that, and that's that. But we went and said, okay, hey everybody, here's how we think we're going to solve this. And the community came back and said, well, what about A, B, or C? I'm like, oh, well, I don't know. I don't think those are good. We think this. And then the community came back stronger. It's like, no, you got that wrong. Here's the way to do it. And so there's a long thread, and then at the end we're like, oh, you know what, you're right. And so we did it the way somebody from the community had suggested it. So again, you know, our goal is not to always be the smartest guys in the room, but to always leave the smartest guys in the room. You know, it's just they learn from the smartest people. So that's worked out great.
You know, here's a question. So Microsoft decides to go, you know, really heavy in Azure a number of years ago. If PowerShell didn't exist, you would have had to invent something. So is PowerShell also like a component that was key to the decision for Azure? Like, we got this, and it's because I know it's a very integrated piece of it. Like, you would have had to develop something going, we want to do this cloud thing. Okay, now what we got to do? Do we borrow Bash?
I'm not so sure about Azure, but certainly there was a story about the last Ignite. And I don't know whether this actually turned into a story or not, but basically some reporter went out with the Exchange guys, and they had lots of drinks, and the Exchange guys basically said, yeah, the whole Exchange Online thing, that was all enabled because of PowerShell. Without PowerShell, it wouldn't have been possible.
Wow.
Because before that, they were doing all these like manual click, click, click tests, and that with PowerShell, now all of a sudden they could automate their tests. Then when they said, okay, now go run it for somebody else, it's like, wait, how am I going to click, click, click? Oh, you don't have to do that. You can script it all. And so they did automatic provisioning, automatic detection and repair, and they basically said that, you know, sort of the whole cloud effort was enabled through PowerShell. So that was very gratifying, very gratifying. And certainly Azure Stack would not be possible with PowerShell. You know, I've got over 250,000 lines of PowerShell in Azure Stack. So pretty big, and we're learning some lessons there. You know, it's teaching me sort of the next round of features that I need to add to PowerShell.
Yeah.
You know, Jeffrey, when the decision was made to open source these items, what kind of pushback did you get from your team? And because it certainly is very different than what they were accustomed to. And I'm kind of curious as to over time how that has changed. Have they kind of come around and realized that there certainly is power in that collaborative approach?
Yeah, actually, the PowerShell team honestly has been pretty far ahead of these things for quite some time. I'll just say I think the company sort of caught up to where the PowerShell team was going. So we'd wanted to do this for a long time. In fact, so I like to tell the story about my VMware friends, and I'll say it, my VMware friends. I got some friends there. The VMware community, who are, if you're not familiar, Microsoft and VMware have been competitors for a while, but they were the early adopters of PowerShell and some of the most active community. And at some point, one of the guys comes to me and says, "Hey, I got a problem here." I said, "Okay, well, let me help you solve your problem." I said, "Well, I got this great automation experience for my Windows users, but my Linux users feel like they're getting second-class automation. And in reality, they are. So, how can you help me with that?" And so we had wanted to get PowerShell on Linux for quite some time. In fact, I had funded a effort that did not end up succeeding to convert PowerShell to native code so that I could do it all on Linux. It turned out that wasn't going to be an approach that worked well for us. Anyway, at some point, get this new leader, Satya Nadella. Satya Nadella says, "Hey guys, get out of your offices, go talk to customers, figure out what they need, and give it to them. Don't worry about the money. If we're making customers successful, we'll figure out how to make money. If you can't make customers successful, it's really hard to monetize that. So just go give them what they need."
That's right.
And when the .NET guys did that, they found out that lots of people loved .NET, but they wanted to run on Linux. So they gave it to them. And when they did the port to .NET to Linux, that's what enabled us to bring PowerShell to Linux. So, but the team their head was already there. It had been very community focused, etc. Not open source, but very community focused.
I think that's a lot of it. So with us being involved in the Linux community, and we've spoken at a lot of different Linux conferences, they bring up the Ballmer years. We'll just say it.
Absolutely.
And because he was so anti to some of the Linux stuff, and that's what we've been trying to convince a lot of our listeners is that there's a lot of change, there's a lot of shift, and Satya Nadella, at the head of that's like, hey, let's embrace open source and things like that. And we're seeing it. Like you said, trust is earned over time, but once you put the code out there, it's out there.
Yeah, I'll just point out, the United States, pretty good friends with Germany and Japan.
Yeah.
Right.
You're able to overcome these things.
Yeah, we have a better relationship now. And they had an extreme dislike for each other.
It turns out, yeah.
Yep.
Good point.
So we were hanging out with the hardware guys last night, looking at the Azure Stack, looking at the physical stuff of it, and we talked about the Dell story and stuff like that. But what's really crazy is thinking that you can drag and drop servers between there. So we're kind of going over the logistics of it. So, okay, I have an Azure Stack node running in my office, and then I can just build something and it's in the portal. So it's like transparent. It's like, oh, this one's in your data center, that one's in Azure, and we were talking about how you can just move a system from one to the other. And like the guy said, well, you can just drag and drop it almost. Like you can just, it creates such a interesting, like how far we've come.
I don't think we're quite there yet. I think that's where it might be from the hardware side we can do that. Right now with Azure Stack, we do not have the ability to add a node to expand the capacity of a stack. That's a very important thing. It's something we didn't get to in GA. But again, because we're agile, we're going to be releasing new features and fixes every month. So it's on the top of my list of things to do.
Once you
but
set up
you'll
the
definitely
node,
be able to.
Yeah, I mean, you can deploy once, so to speak. And that's it's all Azure, and it's really slick.
It is.
That is
Pretty exciting.
I could see like really good use cases. Just going back to PowerShell for a second. That PowerShell and Linux, because I work in healthcare, and there's me and a couple guys that are Linux guys, but the other 10 people in my team are all Windows guys. So a couple of them know PowerShell, I know Bash, so I can throw PowerShell on there, and then they can still get in and run their scripts or run their commands on our Linux, our Ubuntu server, and get the same. The same experience of what we're both expecting. They're expecting one experience, I'm expecting another, but on the same machine.
Exactly.
And that's what's awesome.
That was really the goal, right? In the past, as you go and talk to companies, there were these like silos, these balkanized silos by technology. Oh, I got my Windows guys, I got my Linux guys. Well, actually, you just want your IT staff, and they should be able to solve anything. And so that's what, the strong goal of the effort was to be able to give the company a tool that all their users could use. They could use it on Windows, Linux, Macintosh, to be able to manage anything. Windows, Linux, Macintosh, running in any cloud. I don't know if you've seen, but PowerShell, we got great support for AWS, Google, and Azure, so any cloud or any hypervisor. Talked about my VMware friends, right? PowerShell, they love PowerShell. So this tool can manage everything. And now, again, the entire company can adopt this to manage anything. And you say, well, now with WSL, you could do Bash on Windows, and you could do the same thing with Bash. And that's true to a degree, but not really. And the reason for that was sort of that core reason why I had to invent PowerShell. And it is this core architectural difference between Windows and Linux. On Linux, everything is basically a file. If you can edit a file and restart a process, you can manage most everything. But on Windows, and in fact, I don't know if I told you the story, but originally that was the effort. My goal was not to invent anything here, right? I was busy doing the lead architect for all the management products and technologies, and I just said, we just have to have a solution. Just get the Linux products, since we had POSIX, Windows services, basically POSIX subsystem, and then all the Unix tools. I said, let's just ship that on Windows for free, and then we'll be done with it. And I tried to get into Windows. I came that close to getting into Windows, but the concern about IP, I didn't. But we made it free. And it turned out it just didn't solve any problems. And why didn't it solve any problems? And the answer is because whereas on Linux everything's text files, on Windows everything's APIs. So grep wouldn't work against the registry, awk wouldn't work against Active Directory, sed wouldn't work against WMI. So we had to have an API-oriented management tool. And the same thing applies. And then I'll point out, I think I've said this before, it's kind of controversial, is that as time goes on, Linux becomes more Linux becomes more Windows-like. And the observation there was that more and more of Linux is being surfaced through APIs, REST APIs, returning structured data, JSON documents.
Yep.
So, in fact, that's where we shine the most, is when you have structured data is exposed through APIs. So, I see the prospects for PowerShell being that tool that does best across all the environments. I'm very bullish on that vision.
Yeah.
It is an interesting change to see that everything is moving. Some of the more advanced Linux systems, you can't store at scale everything just as a file all the time. So
right.
you run into some of those limitations. So I will admit I've seen that as Linux changes a little, which creates its own controversies in the Linux community, unrelated to Microsoft, as we move over there. But it is a necessary thing to have these REST APIs, so that interface. I think it's nice having PowerShell as an option, because from a Linux perspective, we just load each tool we need. And now it's just one more shell we can load. And I really like that, because I have stuff that runs in Perl. I got stuff that runs in Python. I'm like, hey, you just throw it on there now. When I have a PowerShell script, I can just go, here, apt-get some PowerShell in here. And
Exactly. By the way, you got it exactly right. Just another shell.
Yep.
Just another shell. You use it, you like it. You don't use it, don't like it. If it, I like to say there's no religion here, right? At some point, when it's early days of PowerShell, people are like, well, I'm trying to get my entire organization to rewrite all their VB scripts to PowerShell. How do I get them to do it? I said, wait, what are you talking about? I mean, if they work, they work. And my guy, he loves VB script. He doesn't want to move to PowerShell. It's like, look, if he's being successful, leave him alone.
Right.
That's fine. It's about the customer, the success of the customer, not about any technology. Now, that said, I believe with those technologies, there are these class of problems you can't solve. And if you don't have those problems, all good. But if you do have those problems, here's the way to solve it. We're not going to be able to solve it with those technologies, but I do solve it with these technologies.
Right.
And then that was that conscious thing about, and therefore, I know the last thing in the world anybody wants to do is to stop and learn a new language. And so I established what I called, I don't know if I talked about this, but I called it the sacred oath. And I said, look, here's my sacred oath to you. I said, I know the last thing you want to do is to learn a new language. I'm asking you to stop and to do that. And my oath to you is, I will commit to use this, and we'll reuse it, and we'll reuse it, and we'll reuse it. So when we had to do configuration, instead of having a different configuration tool, it's PowerShell. We extend PowerShell to do that. And now taking that and say, oh, well, I need to manage Linux systems. Instead of saying, oh, well, I'll have a new tool to manage Linux systems. No, same tool, we'll port it. And so the goal was to say, if you've learned this technology, I'm going to invest in you and make sure that you and your career and your skills have maximal impact and maximal economic return. At the end of the day, I want people to be able to say, put PowerShell on their resume and get lots of money for doing it. And I love this show because so many people tell me that. I mean, they stop me in the hallway and they're like, oh my God, thank you, thank you, thank you. I've tripled my salary. Tripled? This has happened more than once.
Wow.
Tripled your salary. That means one of two things, like you're overpaid now or you were underpaid then, which just happens. That's just crazy. But literally, they've tripled their salary. And nothing makes me feel better when I hear about the success of my customers.
Yeah, and that's awesome because you can take that same skill set. You learned PowerShell, say, 10 years ago, or I can't remember the release date of when PowerShell first came out. It was Windows
coming up
Windows 7, right? And right.
Yeah.
I can't remember the names of my kids.
But you learned it then, and now it's being integrated into Azure and even right through the web GUI now. You're going to be able to provision servers with PowerShell in the web page, so you can go onto any computer. You don't have to install PowerShell to get it to work.
Yeah, that's so exciting now. So what he's referring to is that we announced the Cloud Shell. In the Cloud Shell, you go up to the Azure portal, and there's a little top button that looks like a prompt, and you can click it, and you have a choice of running PowerShell on Windows or Bash on Linux. And it's running in a container in Azure, and then you can use that to manage everything. And in particular, we populate it with a bunch of great tools. We populate it with Git and with the Azure commandlets, so they're always up to date. Those things are rapidly changing, so keeping up to date is a challenge. Those environments will always be up to date. And here's the cool thing. We didn't show it, but I'm going to show in my talk today. You can bring up the Bash shell, be running Linux, and then you can run PowerShell. We put the Linux version of PowerShell in the Bash environment, in the Linux environment.
Oh no! Shell inside shell inside shell.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's so exciting. And by the way, now let's be clear. That's from there you can do anything. So you can bring that thing up, right? Bring up a Bash shell, run PowerShell, and then go manage your AWS instances, right? You can. It's not limited to managing Azure. You can go manage, load the VMware module and start managing VMware. It's crazy.
Wow.
It's just crazy.
Well, in PowerShell's power in like the latest versions, we'll go all the way down to the desktop, like Windows 10 and things like that. I own a support company, so my team can remote in, and it's really, the same concept I've done for years with Linux servers. We can just get in the background without actually connecting to the desktop when the customer has a problem, and my guys can issue a couple PowerShell commands to get something done without having to actually log into the computer. It's almost weird to me think that we're shelling into Windows at the back end level. Oh, we're just going to make an adjustment, restart the print service, whatever, clear the queue with a couple PowerShell scripts we have saved. We got them all queued up, and it's really neat to think about that. I never pictured doing that for Windows. I've been doing in the desktop for a long time, and now it's simple. It's just like we do in Linux.
Oh, neat. No, that's great. You should say that. So, in fact, another talk I'm giving today is on Azure Stack Security.
Oh.
And we leverage PowerShell. PowerShell has fantastic security capabilities. In the beginnings, I don't know if you know the story, it's hilarious. So at some point we start to see the bad guys start to use PowerShell.
Yes.
Then they start to love PowerShell. And I was like, oh my heavens, what's going on here? Well, when you drill into it, what it turns out is they never had used PowerShell to crack a system. They cracked the system using some other technique, browser or phishing attack, whatever. But then once they're there, and once they can use any code that they want to, they chose PowerShell. Why'd they choose PowerShell? Well, it turns out hackers have exquisite taste in technology. So that's one answer. But no, seriously, it made them more productive. They were able to do more productive stuff. And I've always said that...
Destructive stuff.
I have always said the only difference between systems management and malware is intent. It performs exactly the same operations. It's just your intent. Anyway, so we found this, and we're like, okay, well, what do we do? And first, we found out that we didn't actually have a problem, right? That it wasn't people were using PowerShell to exploit systems. They were just using it because it was a great tool. But then we said, well, okay, but still, how can we help? And with PowerShell version 5, and if you search PowerShell loves the blue team, you'll see great detail on it. But basically, we added a whole bunch of logging and transcripting capabilities and things like that. So now at the latest Black Hat and DerbyCon conferences and DEF CON, basically the meme going around the hacker community is, hey, we got to stop using PowerShell. It's become a malware honeypot. If you use PowerShell for your exploit kit, you are going to get caught. So we got to switch tools. So I felt so good about that. Now, one of the tools we have is this idea of JIA, just enough admin. And what you can do is you can say, hey, I've got an access control list, right? And I'm going to only allow these users in, and you can specify that these are only users, that they're not admins. But when they connect, they get admin privileges, but to only run certain tasks.
Oh, yeah.
So you can set it up and you say, hey, you don't have admin privileges, but when you interact with these systems, you can have admin privileges to restart the queue or reset this, etc. And what that allowed us, we use that extensively in Azure Stack to basically build these blast containers, right? Which said, hey, there's lots of moving parts and they all have to talk to one another. We took this assume breach mentality, which said, hey, we're going to harden the heck out of it, but assuming that we miss something and a bad person gets in here, what can they do? And the answer is, well, they only have user privileges, and they can if they connect here, the only thing they can do is these things. So we basically have this architecture of blast containers, like a submarine, right? So the blast, close it, they get that, but nothing else.
That's good. Yeah, it reminds me of sudo in Linux. And
Exactly.
But it's
very
so strong.
It's been a while since I looked at sudo, but like we can say, hey, you can only run stop service, but then we can also say you can only stop service for these 5 services. So you can have parameter level control, which parameters get surfaced and which values can be accepted. It's one of the benefits of PowerShell's architecture. We own the parser, and when you own the parser, man, you own the world.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's interesting because that's the big security topic is, all right, we realize there's going to be systems that get compromised and they get in, but it's preventing lateral movement when you get in, logging where they are, because that's, having dealt with breaches and things like that, is trying to sort that out is so difficult. How'd they get to the next step? And then did they wipe all the logs with it? So PowerShell logging, definitely, like you said, it's a honeypot because now we can trace the lateral movement. We can see what they tried and see what their approach was. But if they find themselves limited to they can just turn their printers on and off, they get thwarted real quick and stopped, and that stops the lateral movement. It's awesome.
You nailed it. And and I don't know if you saw this, but basically what we did was we solved this problem in PowerShell version 5. And then my security architect, Lee Holmes, rockstar security guy. Anyway, he went and then said, hey, here are the general principles that we've established. And then he reached out to the Python community and said, hey, you should consider these things. And so there's a formal PEP for Python for these security things. And in fact, there's an implementation of that called SPython. So basically, we're going to go try and take these concepts and clean up the world of dynamic languages. Turns out in static languages, we've been adding security features for the last 20, 30 years. But dynamic languages are very, very powerful, and they thwart a lot of the things, the attacks. They basically haven't done the same thing. Well, we've established, Lee has established some principles that we think that we can go drive through the community to clean up all the dynamic languages to make everybody more secure. So very excited about that.
Security is like foremost with all the latest breaches and everything else. I mean, you can't turn on the news or open up Twitter without seeing another one. So.
Yeah, exactly. His comment is like, well, hey, if you could do this, or you could write 143 million apology letters, right?
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, one of the biggest things is the escalation of privilege. And again, coming back to, what you guys have implemented into PowerShell, that's awesome. The attacker will think they have admin privileges because they can do one or two things, but then you block out everything else they try to do.
You really should come to my security talk this afternoon on Azure Stack Security. I used to be a very, very hardcore curmudgeon when it came to security, like big time pessimist, like, okay, we'll do this, but it's never going to work. And I recently, over the last few years, become an optimist. One was the work Lee had done with PowerShell, but the second was the work we're doing with Azure Stack. And so here's the gestalt of it. When I ship, I ship general purpose Windows Server, right? As lead architect for Windows Server, I ship that. How do I secure it? And the answer is, I really can't secure it. I can give security capabilities, but then the person that deploys it has to secure it. They have to decide what's appropriate and not appropriate, etc. With Azure Stack, it is not a general purpose system. It is a specific built system. I know all the parts, and there are lots of parts, and I know exactly what should be where and exactly who they can communicate with. So we've locked this thing down. You cannot run code that I have not digitally signed. Okay, so on this machine, only this code can run. On that machine, only this code can run. And guess what? If you somehow find a way to crack that, you won't, but if you do, the only thing it can do is to talk this protocol to these machines. It can't go beaconing out and exfiltrating information to China. No, it talks SQL to that machine. Boom. So I've got, like the networking. I've got Tor ACLs. I have 2 types of SDN ACLs, and then I've got internal firewall rules. Each machine has device guard, credential guard, Windows Defender. I mean, this thing is just, I share this with my security friends, and they're like, oh my God, you're doing it right. And they're so jealous, because often you just sit there like, hey, you should do it this way. And it also almost comes off like being a scold as they try and so forcefully tell people, you really need to do it this way, only to see people like, yeah, I'm busy. Or, no, that would be hard. And here, I don't have to tell anybody to do anything. I'm doing it. And just feel like, oh, yay.
Right. I was at the Azure ATP, and that was impressive.
Is that crazy?
I like that. So the way that it gives you notifications, and I imagine you had some influence somewhere in there. Some of the
Lee, maybe. I'm a dope when it comes to security. I care about security passionately, but I'm a dope when it comes to it. Lee, in fact, Lee did the Lee and Filippo, who I'm going to do the talk with. They were the driving forces for the security around Azure Stack. So that's one of those things I learned, man. When you find somebody good, like, give them runway.
That's right.
But all the reporting that you've built in is what they're relying on, so we can see. And it was really fascinating because that's, once again, for it comes to security, we need to know what's going on and those trigger points of when they're trying. Are they starting to try passwords? Are they touching your honey tokens? What are they doing to get that started? And it was really neat seeing all that. It's a really cool system.
Well, the other thing that's fascinating is the fact that we have such a, I think at the end of the day, so here I'll make a bold statement, right? So remember when Bill Gates said in 2 years spam's going to be solved, and then 2 years later it was like, what a dope. But let me ask you this: is spam a big problem for you?
No.
Personally, it's reduced.
Yeah, it's sort of silently at some point, like, wow, that sort of went away. So in the end, he was right. So I'm going to make a similar comment. I think that security, I'm not going to give a time frame, but I think security is going to transform from one of these like unsolvable menaces into an occasional annoyance. And in particular, this is for the people who utilize the cloud. Let me be clear about that.
Exactly.
And so then why? And the issue is it's an aperture issue. Same thing with spam. Spam really got solved when a critical mass of inboxes were controlled by 3 entities, and those 3 entities then communicated and collaborated on signals. Same thing's going to happen with security, right? So, for instance, you have Exchange, Mail, and then Defender. So when they detect a phishing attack, right, they can then run that phishing thing in a blast container, and in that blast container they can see the signals that thing's doing, and then take that and then feed it into Defender and send it out to the entire world. So inoculate the entire world. So effectively we're going to get herd community. Now another way to think about this is when it comes to security, really most people are sort of at this stage of the Wild Wild West, right? You're out there on your cattle ranch by yourself. You sit out on the porch with a rifle and a blanket to defend your ground, right?
Yeah.
But at some point, when you're not on a ranch and you're in a town, you can like hire a sheriff. And when you have a city, you can hire a police force. And when you're a nation, you can hire Navy frickin' SEALs, you know? And I think in the cloud, you're going to be getting to that point where you can hire the Navy SEALs, or the Navy SEALs are going to be working for you behind the scenes, and it's not something you pay attention to.
Jeffrey, I was going to ask a question. A few moments ago, you were just mentioning that the 3 entities got together as far as, or the largest entities got together as far as solving that spam problem. I wanted to ask you, as far as the cloud providers, the major cloud providers, has there, because they do have some common concerns, And has there been any kind of communication?
Oh yeah, that's been going on
You know,
for
okay.
always. I'll tell you that our security people just respect the heck out of the Google people, out of the AWS people. We share intelligence. We have common threats. No, that's an unsung story. That story really should be told. No, that goes along very well. Look, every now and again, it has splashy things. Oh, the Google guys told about a 0 day when we weren't ready. Blah blah blah. Like, hey. Okay, we have little flashes in the ponds about protocols and timings, etc. That dissuades from the true story. The true story is thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Google, for finding our exploits. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That gives us the opportunity to become better and better defend our customers. Recently, apparently, we announced we found some exploits in Google Chrome, and we shared it with them. And I'm just absolutely confident that they're standing there saying, thank you, Microsoft. Look, we're all aligned on this. Again, little details about disclosure policies,
well, the news
notwithstanding.
Needs to make news.
Exactly.
But no, I imagine there is a lot of camaraderie. I mean, you guys, there's you, Amazon, and Google. You're working towards a very similar, platform. So sharing information is important.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
you're more friendly than the news would like us to believe.
Before we got up here to start talking, we were chatting a little bit about the history of, what you're taught when you're coming into IT. And we were talking about, the new programmers, people coming in, they're not taught about page faults and some of this hardware stuff because it's abstracted away.
Yeah.
And I can see that's what's happening with security out in the cloud, is that it's being abstracted away. It's being done on the underlining layer, and then you get on and use that.
Yeah, here's the other reality. Like, when in the future, when we look back, we'll realize that most of us, we're not very good at security anyway.
Right.
No, honestly, it's really true. Because, you got another day job, blah, 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 blah. In reality, most people, security is sort of a part-time thing, or if you have a department, but, it's not like the world's best. Here's the thing, again, when you have scale, right? Same thing with spam. We can afford to hire the world's best talent, and we do, right? And then, because I can amortize that across a very large number, right? When you're doing it by yourself, it's hard to do that. And also, those world-class people, they don't want to solve problems that are small scope. They want to change the world. So the world's best people want to work on the world's hardest problems, because when they solve it, they get to say, me, I did it. And so there's a real benefit to that.
Awesome.
A great sense of accomplishment.
Yeah. In kind of sum up some of what you said, like Satya Nadella said, and he quoted Bill Gates, it's we underestimate overestimate the short term, but underestimate the long term.
Yeah.
And the spam problem, he thought in 2 years. We did solve it, but it took more than 2 years.
Right.
Yep.
All right.
Good. One thing I wanted to mention too, I was unfortunately I didn't get a chance to attend your keynote yesterday live, but I did listen to it on I think it was YouTube.
Oh, great.
And there was you had there was a portion of it where you talked about and we're going to go off security a little bit, but it was the DevOps was this chasm of despair, as you called it, which I thought was really a great descriptor. And then I think you went on to talk about how that has changed or how it can be changed and that type of thing. And I wanted to find out from you, as far as the collaboration of the open source community. That at least historically, and they've certainly had their arguments and that type of thing. I'm wondering if how much you've learned from them as far as how to take something from point A to point B, because based on my experience as an individual user, there's really a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, and I'm just curious how that's transformed you.
Yeah, absolutely. I've learned a ton from the Linux community. Now, first I'll say a number of people will take a look at DevOps and the principles of DevOps and say, hey, that's what we've been doing for the last 20 or 30 years. And at some level that's true, but those were the best of the best. And in reality, they occasionally did it and sometimes they didn't. But they knew that was the right thing to do. I think it was really the Linux community that then took that and mainstreamed it as an effort and mainstreamed it as a community. And why the Linux community? And the answer is because the startup crowds, right, doing this internet startups and running at very large scale, they were the ones who truly benefited from these approaches, okay? And so they were the ones that were Linux first, and they use these things and they get massive benefits, and so they started talking about that. And I'll also say that in the past, Linux was far easier to automate than Windows was. Prior to PowerShell, it was just hard to automate Windows. And just to be clear, PowerShell didn't solve that problem. PowerShell enabled that problem to be solved. What you really needed was the critical mass of all the commandlets. And so we didn't have that at the first version. Anyway, so while this was all taken off and people were running these websites with Linux, they were developing these DevOps concepts and then starting to have and because of that natural tendency towards community, they shared those concepts and then rallied people. And so I really credit that community for mainstreaming these concepts, absolutely. And great phrases, great way to discuss it. I will say I think that there's a little bit too much discussion about what DevOps is and what it isn't. And actually, I don't know if I told you, I now think a little bit differently about it. I think that DevOps is great, but not quite it. And I think really what's it is digital transformation. And when I define digital transformation, it is put the customer value at the center of everything you do and re-engineer everything. And when you do that, DevOps just flows. However, if you start with DevOps, it could be that you have a great, we like each other, we're doing things in small batches, and who cares about this customer thing, right? So you could just be more efficient at delivering the wrong thing.
Right.
And so I think if you put the customer first, you get DevOps, but not necessarily the other way around. And now let me be clear, there's practical things to this. Like when I go to a DevOps conference, I'll know that they get it when I start to see sessions like how to hold customer interviews, how to know when a customer is telling you something that's true versus they think it's true. How do you manage that? How do you get a true customer signal? So anyway, that's my view on that. But yeah, no, the Linux community's done a great job there.
No, and that's a lot of it. We start in the Linux community. We start with, okay, this is the problem we need to solve, and you kind of, it's working your way back ship, but it's also crowdsourced at the same time on GitHub. So we're getting this perpetual feedback as we're writing commits in code or making code changes. Like the guy who fixed something in only a matter of an hour after I submitted. Hey, it'd be cool if it did this. He goes, well, it does this now. Here's a version increment number. So I think that helps in the Linux community. Now Microsoft, as they embrace that, it's just really accelerating. Things are happening so much faster. Like
right.
From thought to product is a shorter term now. The life cycle.
Well, actually, you bring up a very good point. I hadn't really thought about that. Now you're going to make me reevaluate. So when your customers can actually code, I think that that they already had that cycle. Like you don't need to have that. How do I have a customer conversation? Because the answer is, if they don't like it, they're going to change your code. It's really when they don't have that. Oh, thank you. That was very helpful. I got to now I got to spend some time thinking.
Change your life thoughts on this. But it only gets better, and it's been fascinating to watch and seeing the hardware, seeing all this here. We've been having a great time here, just all the lead up to this. I'm like,
neat.
It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right.
Great. Well, any other questions for Jeffrey?
I don't have any. I think we're coming right down to the end here.
Okay. Well, listen. I want to encourage everybody in the Linux community to please try out the PowerShell commandlets and PowerShell on Linux. And I'm very eager. At Microsoft, we embrace the red, right? We love to hear when like Bill Gates, used to beat everybody up, and at some point, like, hey, Bill, you're kind of a jerk, right? And his answer was, hey, positive feedback isn't actionable. It's like, oh yeah, that's right.
Yep.
So that was where it's all about embrace the red. So I'm very eager to hear about where we're not doing, meeting customers' needs, and in particular, if I've got something culturally wrong, like, no, that's not the way we do it here, or you're really missing something important. Super eager to hear that. We really do want to be just another shell, but just another great shell on Linux.
And there's so many scripts out there. So once again, it makes it easy. If I load the shell, I already have access to a lot of things that work in PowerShells. There's a lot of code out there. So you can load it on Linux, and then you have access to, it's just like Python. I loaded Python because I have a few things in that. I can load PowerShell, and there's a plethora of things out there already. It's not hard to find it.
Right. Well, that's the Unix model, right? It's a toolkit.
It's a toolkit.
That's
Another tool in the toolkit, baby.
I mean,
Excellent.
all can play happy together on one system.
Exactly. Just to be clear, in PowerShell, easy to call awk-grep said. Happy
Yep.
days.
Yes.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah, if it was here, his license plate is PS Aux.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Cool.
That's a great plate. Oh,
Yep.
okay.
All right.
You guys know
So I
Mad
guess-
Dog? I actually worked with Mad Dog when he got the Linux Live Free or Die license plate. That was a real
Oh
thing.
yeah.
Oh, great.
Nice.
Cool.
That's cool.
Okay. Well,
All right.
I
Alright.
guess we'll wrap it up
Yep.
then.
Yeah.
This was the Sunday Morning Linux Review. This was episode 251, Fresh Looks at Microsoft Ignite, a conversation with Jeffery Snover, Technical Fellow at Microsoft. I'm Mary Tomich.
Tony Bemis.
And Tom Lawrence.
We'll see you next time.
Thanks.
You've been listening to the Sunday Morning Linux Review. If you would like more information about this or other shows, go to smlr.us. Feel free to send comments to show@smlr.us or give us a call at 734-258-7009. I'm John Miller. If you don't like it, you can
Bite my 8-bit metal ass. That's bite with a Y.